Throughout my 30 years as a military historian, I've been haunted by the Western Front. And now, with the millennium spinning to its close, I want to try to put it into some sort of perspective. I want to draw out those dreadful contrasts where ancient ideas of patriotism met industrial forces of unprecedented power. If we owe anything to the men who fought here, and I think we do, it's surely to understand as much as we can what they did and why they did it. I'm making the same journey as the troops of the British Expeditionary Force in that fateful August of 1914, but aboard this sleek symbol of a new Europe. At the outbreak of war, the railway played a crucial role. It sped men to what was to become a strip of murdered nature, running all the way from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. The railway was a potent symbol of the huge industrial growth transforming Europe before 1914. This technological revolution was also producing weapons of unprecedented power that would dominate any war to come. Such was the speed with which men and machines could be put into the field that diplomats and politicians no longer had the breathing space to reflect on their decisions. Once mobilization was underway, there was little time for second thoughts. On the 28th of June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell victim to a Serbian bullet in the Balkan town of Sarajevo. The web of treaties and alliances that bound European states together began to throttle the continent. Within days, each nation prepared to go to war in support of its ally. That scorching summer, a Balkan crisis and a European war came to mean the same thing. The war plans were all so finely tuned that it was unthinkable to let an enemy get a head start in the mobilization race. The generals knew that war had its own timetable. Once started, it would be impossible to stop. In Berlin and St. Petersburg, in London and Paris, war fever swept across Europe. Everywhere, crowds poured onto the streets. Soldiers marched, and people found themselves drawn like moths to a flame to the railway stations. Tens of thousands of men flocked through these great Parisian railway termini in some bizarre and urgent parody of a summer holiday. These struck some people like the bellies of great carnivorous beasts. It was said that men were mangés par la gare d'Est, eaten by the Eastern Station. In the entrance hall of the Gare de l'Est, there's a huge painting that captures all the heady excitement and pain of men leaving their loved ones to go to war. It was painted in 1926. The artist, Albert Erté, depicts himself looking on as his son, Everett, boards the train. Everett was killed in the last year of the war. Notices like this appeared on the 1st of August, recalling reservists to the colours. The French army, like that of Germany, was made up of conscripts, for whom mobilization was very much a mixed blessing. In a Breton village, the mobilization order was greeted with a petrified numbness. Not a voice applauded. Then somebody sobbed once. The crowd began to move, and everyone went their separate ways home. About 3/4 of French soldiers were peasants. And in the back of so many of their minds was the worry about what would happen to the harvest. Germany's nightmare was a war on two fronts against France and Russia. She gambled everything on a quick victory. She planned to send 3 large armies through Belgium and into northern France. One would swing round Paris to encircle the French armies and so win the war in a single stroke. The French planned to attack straight into Alsace-Lorraine, the 2 provinces which they had lost to Germany in an earlier war. The further east they went, the easier it would be for the Germans to come round behind them. With surprise in essence, Germany invaded Belgium on the 4th of August, advancing at speed through this tiny country. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. Its violation brought an immediate declaration of war against Germany and the rapid dispatch of troops to France. The British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, although highly professional, comprised a mere 100,000 men, a pitiful number compared with the millions of conscripts Germany and France were putting into the field. The BEF was sent to a position in northern France between the Channel and the French army, most obviously because it was easiest to get there. But as there was no formal alliance between Britain and France, the French felt that they couldn't count on British support. It's an understatement to say that relations between Britain and France haven't always been good. This memorial of a French revolutionary soldier right in the middle of the area where the British assembled dates from a time when they certainly weren't. And even in 1914 there were tensions. One senior French general, when asked how many British soldiers he wanted in France, had replied, "Just one, and we'll take good care that he's killed." The French saw the BEF more as a promissory note. Not much use in the short term, but very valuable if, God forbid, the war wasn't over by Christmas. However, the French misreading of German plans was soon to become painfully clear. Far from being in a quiet backwater, the BEF was to find itself hurtling into a raging inferno. The BEF was taken rapidly to the frontier by railway, but not always in first-class comfort. To avoid complicated marshalling problems, the French had organised troop trains which loaded guns, ammunition, men and horses on the same train. This meant that men might find themselves glancing longingly at the one coach reserved for officers while they clambered into cattle trucks. One eyewitness remembered the Tommies mooing and barring as their train clattered out of Le Havre. The War Book meticulously defined this whole complex process. Its detailed directives included 87 pages devoted to railways. At the height of the expedition, there were 144 trains a day serving the BEF. Booking clerks were recruited to change pounds into francs as men jumped off the trains. Timetables were worked out to the last detail. There were even 10 minutes for a cup of coffee at Amiens station. This is Maubeuge, one of the railheads used by the BEF. There were scenes of frantic activity as men, horses and guns were unloaded from the trains.
It was frightfully hot. We all had a raging thirst. The horses were in an equally bad state. It had been dinned into us as young officers, first look after the horses, then look after your men, and last of all yourselves.
Now that they'd reached the railhead, men marched, like their grandfathers before them, shouldering rifle and pack. The first blow to patriotic enthusiasm came not from enemy fire, but from sore backs and blistered feet as men trudged the tree-lined cobbled roads of northern France. What sort of army was the BEF? It was largely made up of regulars and regular reservists, old sweats who'd wet their moustaches in canteens from Dublin to Delhi. They were commanded by Field Marshal Sir John French, who'd made his reputation in the Boer War. In August 1914, he was widely regarded as the most eminent British cavalry officer since Cromwell. Yet, like so many of his contemporaries, he could not accept that technology had thrown the balance of war in favour of defence. His military thinking refused to admit that the field gun, rifle and machine gun would stop an army dead in its tracks. The officers who crossed this elegant marble hallway in the Army Staff College in Surrey had been taught that there was only one route to victory: attack. They knew all too well the deadly power of modern weapons, as this memorial shows. They'd studied modern war. Yet everyone, Germans, French, Russians and British, thought only of attacking. Why? Because if you allowed yourself to be daunted by all this firepower, then war would simply bog down in a stalemate. Field Service Regulations 1908 declared, "Decisive success in battle can be gained only by a vigorous offensive." The French, to be sure, were even more extreme. Their 1913 regulations announced, "The French army, returning to its traditions, henceforth recognizes no law save the offensive." Attack was etched deeply into the French army's psyche. This was reflected in the uniforms it wore, which would not have been out of place in Napoleon's army. There had been a pre-war attempt to replace the red trousers with something more subtle, but the War Minister turned it down with the words, "The red trouser is France."
I was moving forward accompanied by my clanking hardware. My fine sabre alone made as much noise as a piano. What were they thinking of, sending me off into the silence dressed up in cymbals? Not me, that's for certain.
The French pressed forward with stunning bravery in an attempt to reconquer the lost provinces. Fire from machine guns, artillery and rifles stopped them dead. France put about 1.5 million men into the field. In the first 6 weeks of the war, 250,000 of them had been killed or wounded. Of all the armies, the British knew best the firepower of modern weapons in defence. Fighting the Boers in South Africa had proved that fieldcraft and marksmanship really mattered. So the BEF went to war in workmanlike khaki and carried the short magazine Lee Enfield rifle. It's sighted up to 2,000 yards, but it's really effective at perhaps 600. Its magazine takes 10 rounds, loaded like this. Men were trained to fire up to 15 aimed shots a minute, but many could do much better than that. I'm rather out of practice. When the British met the Germans for the first time at Mons, on the 23rd of August, their rifle fire was ferocious. This film was shot just after the war, and many of its extras were actually veterans. But there were simply too many Germans for the BEF to stop them, and it had to fall back to avoid being encircled. On the 26th of August, it fought another, more costly battle at Le Cateau, south of Mons. The guns of the Royal Horse Artillery went into action to stem the German advance. The 13-pounders the BEF used are still in action today as part of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery. Guns and uniforms look much as they would have done at the outbreak of war. In turn, the skills of the artillery drivers in 1914 would have been familiar to the men who fought Napoleon. They moved fast, understood the lie of the land, and were superb horsemen. But to Wellington's troops, the gun they pulled would have seemed like some sort of death ray.
Without the slightest warning, a ranging shot dropped into the battery. The guns were ready for marching, not for fighting. Half the horses were away being watered. As soon as we got number 6 gun into action, I jumped into the seat and began firing. These 13-pounder guns can be fired at the rate of 15 rounds a minute. And though we were perhaps not doing that, we were still doing splendidly. And it was really telling on the Germans.
With the guns covering its retreat, the BEF continued to fall back before the German advance. The campaign reached its climax on the River Marne in the first week of September. The French offensive had failed utterly, and the Germans were close to Paris, with victory almost within their grasp. The war now hung in the balance. Two men had the scales in their hands. General Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, refused to be panicked. He was a bluff son of the soil. He always had 8 hours sleep and 2 cooked meals a day, eaten in reverent silence. General von Moltke, by contrast, had none of the solidity of his opponent. He worried. Unable to control the battle from his headquarters away in distant Luxembourg, he began to lose his nerve. Moltke had good reason to feel uneasy. The French were straining every nerve to stop him. Paris was a fortified city with its own garrison, and part of it went out in taxicabs like this to fall on the German right flank. The blow played its part in breaking Moltke's nerve. He sent out a trusted staff officer in another bone-shaking car to consult the army commanders and authorize a withdrawal. Sir John French's resolve also faltered. He felt that his army was worn out and decided to fall back to rest and refit. At a stormy meeting in Paris, he was overruled and agreed to join the French army fighting on the Marne. After a confused battle, the Germans began to retreat, with the Allies in pursuit. The threat to Paris was lifted. The tide of war seemed to have turned and begun to ebb northwards. The German retreat encouraged many observers to believe that it was all over. that this campaign would be like so many others in history. Advance, decisive battle, retreat, peace. But as the BEF cautiously followed up the Germans, it was in for a shock. The Germans, far from continuing their retreat, had decided to make a stand here on the River Aisne. They dug in on the wooded spurs overlooking it. Every bridge on this section of river had been blown. It's a tribute to the BEF's sheer guts that it got across the river at all, covered as it was by German guns. Flimsy bridges were slung across by engineers. The troops went over at night in heavy rain. Thunderstorms had swollen the river 16 feet below. All that the men had to guide them as they crossed was the light of a lantern, flashed from the far bank.
We finally emerged at the top, near Soupier Farm, advancing over stubble and across a beet field. One shocking sight was a boy trumpeter being bowled over by a direct hit and rolling over and over like a big toy.
The Germans dug into these slopes overlooking the river were in an impregnable position. The BEF could get no further. Even Sir John French, cavalryman though he was, quickly realised what had happened. He wrote to the king, "I think the Battle of the Aisne is very typical of what battles in the future are likely to resemble. Siege operations will enter largely into the tactical problem. The spade will be as great a necessity as the rifle." It was what all sides feared. A German memorandum of 1905 warned,
If attacks failed, war might become a question of advancing, digging in, advancing again, using every means of modern science to dislodge the enemy behind his cover.
trench warfare had developed throughout the 19th century. During the American Civil War, it was used with dismal effect, frequently bringing armies to a grinding halt. It protracted war and drained an army of supplies and men. The British Army went to France well equipped for attack, but less prepared for digging trenches. In fact, there were precious few spades in the BEF. Men carried these nifty little entrenching tools as part of their webbing equipment, but digging in with these was sheer hard graft. Small wonder that spades were borrowed from the engineers or commandeered from local farms.
Usually the men are lazy about digging at first, but after a little shelling, they're all the other way. And it is important that you prevent them digging the trench so deep they can't fire out of it.
Even if, as the Aisne suggested, it was going to be difficult to get through trench lines, it ought to be possible to get round them. And in the early autumn, that's exactly what both sides tried to do, slipping northwards to outflank each other. It was called the Race to the Sea. It brought the British to Ypres, where the Germans were trying to break through along the coast. The Germans very nearly managed it on a couple of occasions. This is the high watermark of their success. It's called Non-Boschen, Nuns Wood. On the 11th of November, the Prussian Guard attacked here. 6-footers coming on through the mist at a jog trot. They were cruelly shot up on the way in. What one British regiment thought was a second wave of attackers was in fact a continuous wall of dead or wounded, lying in a turnip field. The Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry counterattacked, throwing the Germans out of the wood and stabilising the line. A captured German sergeant major politely asked the British officer what lay behind. When told that there was only brigade headquarters, he exclaimed, "Good God." Both sides only slowly grasped how close the Germans had come to a breakthrough. There was not to be another chance. Through November, the war of movement ground to a halt. Everywhere men dug in, with the prospect of spending Christmas in the trenches. The defences cut through Sanctuary Wood near Ypres were typical. Shallow, temporary affairs that gave little protection against exploding shells and ricocheting bullets.
The fire was so intense that many of our bayonets were broken by bullets. By some means, turnips had been built in the parapet. The pieces showered in and around the trench.
Once it became clear that nobody was going anywhere in a hurry, trenches became more sophisticated. The ones that have been preserved at Sanctuary Wood date from much later in the war. Time has mellowed them, but their dog-tooth zigzag and deep dugouts are still clearly visible. As men spent the war's first winter in the freezing misery of the line, they were conscious of forming part of a troglodyte world. It ran from the North Sea to Switzerland. Trenches in the dunes on the coast. Trenches in the chalky uplands of Champagne. Trenches in the forests of the Argonne. Trenches in the hills of the Vosges. The war had gone to earth.